Hello everybody, Ben Woodruff here. Today's video, I'm going to be doing something a little out of the ordinary. If you're used to my channel, usually I do videos about falconry, where I teach about the ancient art of falconry, or sometimes I'll teach geology or paleontology, or take you on some of my adventures out in the deserts or the mountains. But today's video, I'm talking about unicorns. Before you go like, no, I'm talking about real unicorns, and it's not going to be what you're thinking at all. And that is partly why I'm making this video. So let's talk about why I'm even making this video at all. So when I was a kid, back in the 1900s, there was, I remember there's ads, and the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus had all these ads going up, 1985, and they said, come and see a real unicorn. Now as a kid, I had enough in my head, I'm like, whatever. It's clearly they're just taking some horse and they're putting, like a fake horn, a prosthetic or something on the head. That was my assumption, and I didn't go and see the circus. But years later, I was talking with some friends about this, and I'm like, okay, well, this is actually kind of strange, because circuses were originally built off of sensationalism, something odd but real. Come see the biggest bull in the world, or, just whatever, strange things, and that was what they were built off of. So I thought, it's highly unlikely that they would have tried to make this their big showroom selling point of saying, hey, look, come see a real unicorn when it's clearly just a horse. So I started looking into it, and I started doing research, and I unraveled this crazy story and this truth about real, honest-to-goodness unicorns. So first of all, let's talk about unicorns. In today's vernacular, the image of a unicorn normally conveys in people's mind a beautiful, pure white horse with big white flowy mane and a horn out of its head. That's what people picture. That's what's depicted. I remember the folders and the trapper keepers and the lunch boxes when I was a kid. Unicorns were very popular, and that's what they're always shown as. Now, additionally, there was also shown winged unicorns. So it was a horse, a big white horse with a white flowy mane, with a horn, and with wings. Now, that's not a unicorn by any way, shape, or form. We're mixing metaphors here. So that, a winged horse in mythology is a Pegasus, and there's no real Pegasus, but there is a real unicorn, and we're going to get to it in a second. Now, you have to understand the trapper keepers and lunchboxes of the 1980s depicting unicorns were not depicting actual unicorns. And I got to pause on this too. A big reason why I'm making this is every few years, my fellow scientists, I want to just yell at them. They'll keep trying to draw attention to science by exaggerating something, saying something really stupid. The news articles will say something like, oh, turns out unicorns were real after all, but they're not like what you'd think. And they will share with you a big, giant, prehistoric animal called Elasmotherium. Now, Elasmotherium lived until the middle of the last ice age. It's the largest member of the rhinoceros family, and it had one giant horn, the base of which basically filled its whole head. And they're like, well, see, it's basically a unicorn. No, it's not. And furthermore, now we got to get into it. We got to talk about these differences here. We're going to talk a little bit of biology before we get into the real unicorns, okay? There's these two family lineages, these two groups. One is Artiodactyla and one is Perissodactyla. Artiodactyla are the even-toed animals. These are like deer and buffalo and goats and sheep and things like that. Perissodactyla are the odd-toed animals. So these are like rhinoceroses and horses and tapirs and things like that. Even elephants are actually in this lineage. So these are the animals where they have one toe, like a horse, or they have three, or they have five, right? Okay, or the even-toed have two, or they have four. So that there's an important difference. Horses are perissodactylids. They only have one, they have an odd number of toes. They only have a hoof. They're running around flipping you off technically all the time. That would be, they're in the Perissodactyla. So now knowing that, some of these scientists are trying to say, well, okay, the members of the rhino family are in Perissodactyla, and so they're related to horses, and a unicorn is basically a horse with a horn, so basically this giant Elasmotherium is a unicorn. It's wrong in more ways than you know. So let's say what actually is a unicorn, according to people who claim it. And you got to get into this, because here's what's interesting about unicorns. when you get into it, well, okay, first let's talk about what they actually look like. Okay, a actual unicorn, and I'm basing this off of historical documents and basing this off of tapestries and accounts from medieval times. So the medieval unicorn, what does it look like? It's always depicted as even-toed. It's cloven-hooved. Okay, it's not like a horse. It doesn't have one hoof. It's cloven-hooved. It has a short, bushy tail that's kind of like a tail that kind of flares out of the end. It has a curly mane. It's not just a mane like a horse. It's got kind of a curly mane. It has a horn, one horn, and very importantly, it has a beard down here. It's very important. Now, there are legitimate hunting texts from the medieval times that teach you how to hunt a unicorn. Now, in these texts, there's texts that have been written that'll be like, okay, look, here's a lord's way to know here's how to hunt with a goshawk, all right? And here's how to hunt foxes from horseback. And here's how to hunt with a trained ferret. And here's how to hunt a stag deer. And here's how to hunt a unicorn, and it gives very specific details on how to do it and how to, use, peasants and herdsmen to go and scare it and to funnel it down into a canyon and blah, 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 blah. It gives details, very specific details. Now, if this was just an animal of mythology, you would not have it alongside the text of all these other real animals. So that first should be kind of a clue, like, well, wait a minute, why are there all these things? So it turns out that there actually were unicorns, but again, it's not what you think. Now, there was a man named Oberon Zell. He used to be named, he was born Timothy Zell, but him and his partner, Morning Glory, are self-proclaimed wizards. They run a religious group here in the United States and have started a lot of movements. He's got a lot of fancy degrees and a lot of interesting psychology, but he's a self-proclaimed wizard and would go to Renaissance fairs, but also takes his religious practices very seriously. Has nothing to do with the unicorn stuff. It's related, but it doesn't actually have to do anything to do with it because he actually did some research himself. Oberon did his research, and he studied unicorns in every form he could. He studied all the ancient texts that he could come across, and this is back before there was the internet, so he's going to actual medieval texts over in Europe. And he concluded, both from the texts and all the paintings and all the tapestries, that unicorns are not, like we view them today, simply a horse with a horn. They absolutely were not. They most definitely had a beard. They most definitely had cloven hooves. And most of them were kind of stocky looking. Some of them were a little taller, but they weren't super tall like a noble horse prancing around. So along with hunting, he found references to Scottish gillies, which are the Scottish herdsmen and the gamekeepers in Scotland who would use unicorns to guard their flocks. And it was given, specific details. And it's like, well, now, so Oberon wondered about this. He thought, okay, well, this sure seems like there was something going on if there's specific details on herdsmen using these. These accounts claimed that real unicorns were really good for guiding the herd. They would be natural leaders, and they would protect the herd, and they would run off wolves, and anybody who was coming out of the property, they'd chase them off, but they were also very gentle with the owners. It's like, well, what are you talking about? What is a unicorn? Well, Oberon read the work of Dr. W.F. Doves, who was a man who in the 1900s made what he called a bull unicorn. So what he did is Doves had also read some of these early texts, and he had concluded that, okay, when an animal that has horns grows the horns, it's not the horns that are growing, it's the skin that grows it. So let me just do a quick understanding here. So antlers, such as on this reindeer here behind me, antlers are made out of bone. They're grown out from the skull, and then the blood vessels retreat, and it dries hard, and then it falls off after a year. And then a new one, even bigger, grows, okay? But they're bone. Horns are different. Horns grow out from the skull, but they are initiated by the skin cells themselves. Horn is actually made out of hair or fur. It's made out of a chemical called keratin. That's a biochemical called keratin. And so what happens is animals that have horns, whether it's a bull or whether it's a a bighorn sheep or a goat or any of these, an antelope, those horns are grown from the skin cells. So the skin cell themselves initiates the growth, and it starts to form up. So the skull will start to grow, and you will have a bony core that will grow up in, but the horn itself will keep growing over that, and it never falls off. That's horns. This is kind of similar to osteoderms in things like crocodiles. So crocodiles have scales, but they also have these bony cores called scutes or osteoderms. And these are these are bone, but they're not part of the skeleton. They are grown downward from the skin. So you have instances like this where there's certain chemicals like bone, calcium, right? Or keratin, which is hair, but is also horn, also feathers. Feathers, horn, and and all these things are all made out of keratin. Feathers, horn, and fur, right? So in this research, Dr. Doves said, well, from the research he's done, he's found is it looks like that actually those little buds of skin, the skin over which eventually a horn is going to protrude, that is what initiates the horn growth, not the skeleton. And so he did a minor procedure. We did a little incision and just kind of like stitched those two buds up, and lo and behold, this bull, this big old giant cow, grew one straight giant horn. And it was, now, I'm not talking about whether or not this is ethical or good or bad. I'm just sharing the history of this. So what happened was, this was kind of a big sensation. It was known for a bit like, wow, this guy made a bull unicorn. So it's a cow with a unicorn horn. So Oberon concluded from his research, oh, by the way, I got to mention too, from Dr. Dove's research, Dr. Doves said that, and he didn't cite his sources, but he said from his research, he had concluded that many people had done this in eons past, in years past, and that this technique, he didn't pioneer it, but he had concluded this was done, and there is records of it in Scotland. So Oberon concluded that the past shepherds, like in Scotland, for example, that they made unicorns using the same process, and that it was kept secret so that they could be sold to the royalty of Europe. And you got to think about this. If in the age where mythology was deeply entrenched in everything, if you had what essentially was a unicorn, I mean, that's an amazing thing. You're like, where did it come from? It came from the forest, or it came from the spirits. I mean, whatever. It came from a realm of magic. You don't share a secret like that on where it comes from. And such a thing would be an amazing gift to a king, or also to be hunted, for a king to hunt a unicorn. Can you imagine that? Like, wow, we don't know where this came from, or I, the king, am going to go hunt this magical creature. But obviously, if you are keeping this a secret on how these things are made, and I'll get to it in a minute on how it's made, if that's the case, then you're not going to really understand it. You're going to be really cautious about letting people know about it. And if not many people know about it, and not many people are practicing the making of unicorns, then there's not going to be many of them in existence. So therefore, if people start to learn of them, they're going to depict them a little differently. They're going to add flourishments and embellishments. For example, you have the same thing with dodos. Dodos were an incredible bird that lived on the island of Mauritius, and they were killed off by people and the animals they brought. They're a giant member of the pigeon family. If you've ever seen an image of them, it probably looked like this. A big, dumpy, fluffy thing, really colorful, with a big floofy tail, and that's, right? That's what we're depicted. That's not what they look like. We know those people who painted those paintings did not ever actually see a dodo. Here's an example of a dodo that was seen by a person who actually saw one. This was painted by the royal artist for the Mughal Emperor of India, who had a live dodo in his collection. Now, if you are an emperor and if you have a royal artist, that artist had better get things accurate, or they're not going to keep their job, and maybe not even their life, right? Let's be honest. That's how royalty often goes. So for a dodo, you're going to depict it accurately. And the most accurate depictions we have, they're far less colorful, other than the little bit of a blue under their chin there. They're much skinnier and less dumpy, and they do not have a big old froofy tail, right? But it's understandable. People who knew of them and had the basic description down, maybe saw a drawing of one, then other artists then added embellishments. So you have a similar thing where over time, and I haven't even told you how they got made yet, but over time, you're going to have artists starting to depict these real unicorns in more dramatic ways. They're going to make them taller. They're going to make them more noble, longer neck, a little more stately than they actually were. So what actually were they? Well, in 1978, Oberon began crossing. He studied the work of Dr. Dove's, and he studied all these ancient Gilly texts from Scotland. And he's like, oh, well, I think this is how it was. So he began crossing Angora goats, which are big, old, fluffy, fancy goats, with Sagan goats. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It's Saagen, Sagan goats. So they're Sagan goats and Angora goats. He started crossing them. And then what he did is he would do the same thing that Dr. Dove's did, where when they were very young, he would do a small medical procedure that was very benign. I mean, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying it was comparatively benign. I mean, good heavens, we brand cattle, where we burn them with brands, right? So it's fairly benign, a little incision, and basically just kind of stitch those horn buds up, and then they just start growing. And what happened is it would start to, when it would grow, it impacted the skull. So the skull would enlarge and be bigger. These animals were much smarter. So the result was an animal with cloven hooves, with a big velvet white coat, with a flowy mane, with not a flowy mane, like a mane that was not just straight like a horse. It was flowy, like in those early depictions. They had a tufted tail, and they had a beard. So this is pretty wild. So basically, the research was done. He found out what were the original actual people who claimed they had unicorns that they used to guard their sheep, and the accounts of how to hunt a unicorn based off of these descriptions and these illustrations and the understanding of things and the fact that it was leading around the herds. Oberon began crossing these and began making these unicorns. Now, the medical procedure, the horns grew together, and the skull and the brain case did grow larger. We still have skulls from these animals left, and you can still see them. And it's like, yeah, you can see they came from a goat, but you can see they were much smarter, and the skull did get much bigger, and they were much more brilliant animals. So, so Oberon gave one of them to a ranch, and two to a retreat area, and kept one as a pet, and 4 went to the circus. He kept making them over the years. Now, the ranch that had one of them reported exactly what the Gillies had said, that as soon as they put it in there, these other older established goats are like, okay, he's our leader, and he immediately took a leadership role and would lead the herd of other goats around and would chase off coyotes. It would run after and chase and attack coyotes, which is exactly what the text said in Europe, that back in the day, that that real unicorns that were kept by these Gillies, that they would actually chase off the wolves. This is pretty amazing. This is really kind of cool. It's kind of strange, and again, it's questionable ethics, but it's a fascinating point about all this. When Oberon started making these unicorns, he was just doing his thing. He was just trying something that wasn't about fame or glory or money or anything. Again, he's a self-proclaimed wizard. And so he would bring this unicorn. They had Lancelot. They would bring this unicorn around. They bring it to Renaissance fairs and bring it to schools and let the school children pet. And imagine what that would have been like for these little kids. Like, oh my gosh, it's a real unicorn. And so eventually this started to catch attention, and the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus wanted to buy them. And Oberon said no, but they worked out a deal to lease them. And so they were rented, and they made a contract for $500,000. This is back in the 1980s. This is a lot of money. So $500,000 for a 4-year contract. And but one thing that always bothered Oberon, because Oberon was like, okay, well, they're unicorns, but we made them. And he was honest with people about how he did it, because he said this is the way unicorns were made back in the day. He was honest about his research with people and explained how he did it. Well, it turns out the circus didn't want that. And so the circus, just lied and said they just materialized. They just showed up at the circus. And the spokesman for the circus, Joe Gold, he told the news, the Sentinel, in 1985, he claimed they were real unicorns. And that was the story that they stuck with, which makes sense. They're trying to make a buck. They're leasing these unicorns. They're trying to make some money. But that always bothered and upset Oberon, who said, no, I've always been honest about how they were made. But that's just how that went. So Oberon made unicorns from 1978 to 1985, and but he patented the process in 1984. Now, I looked it up, and you can see the patent on how it was done. I got a couple shots here from the patent. You can just look it up online. So he patented the actual process. But again, he got the idea from Dr. Doves from the early 1900s, who got the idea from early texts from Scotland. It was interesting. They kept touring around with these unicorns and sharing them with people. One of the unicorns, Lancelot, was seized by the government. Apparently there was a 1921 law in Florida saying it prohibits the displaying of disfigured animals. And he said, it's not disfigured. It's his natural skull. It's like, no, you've somehow, bolted something in there. And so he was seized by the government. The government took x-rays and they said, nope, this is his real skull. He's really growing it this way. It's the real skull. It's the real horn. There hasn't been any genetic alteration. It's just growing that way naturally. And so it was released without charges. It was pretty interesting. So Oberon stopped making these unicorns in the 1990s. And it's a fascinating principle. It's a point to be said. Now, again, this video is not talking about whether or not the ethics of this line up. I'm not saying whether or not this is good or bad. I'm saying this is fascinating, and I'm saying this is something that's been done for probably over 1,000 years. Just very few people figure it out, and when they do, they keep it close as a close secret. So just to sum it up, medieval herders in Europe did make these out of Angora goats from Switzerland. And they used these fancy breeds with the fancy wool to make them. And they were especially used in Scotland. And they were great for protecting the herd. They were smarter. They had a bigger skull. They were natural protectors. And as the myth grew, things kind of changed. So an interesting point about this is, once a myth starts growing, you got to back it up. You got to find new ways to back it up. So one of the things that happened out of Scandinavia, there is a type of whale called a narwhal. And narwhals have a tusk. It's a tooth. Sometimes they have two. But one of them, especially on the males, will start to grow out, and it pierces through their lip and comes out, and it grows in a spiral. There are these beautiful ivory tusks that grow in a straight spiral. And once the unicorn myth started to spread throughout Europe and Scandinavia, they're like, hey, we're going to make some royal gifts to another country back and forth. Okay, here we're going to give you some unicorn tusks. These are real unicorn horns. And because they were so much larger, a real unicorn horn is, no more than 2.5 feet long, right? But these narwhal tusks, they can be 5, 6, 7 feet long. And if you have a tusk that big that you're claiming is a unicorn horn, well, that fits in the mind of people. And again, there are royal thrones in Europe and in Scandinavia where the thrones themselves on all the corners have these horns. And they claim, oh, they're unicorn horns. No, they were narwhal tusks. But again, the myth of the unicorn had grown. And so they started, depicting them as bigger, a longer neck and with a longer horn, until by our time, people, when you say unicorn, people just picture them as a regular horse, big old white horse with a big old horn, which is not the case at all. So I think this is a fascinating thing, and to know that there really were real unicorns. So the real unicorns of history were brought back into our time in the 1980s and 1990s, and it's a fascinating thing to tell. So I wanted to share this video for a while because I just think it's such an odd topic. And again, as a scientist, it bothers me when, again, every few years, somebody will make a news article and be like, oh, the elasmotherium is technically a unicorn. No, it's not. And so there actually were unicorns, and now you know about them. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't already, if you could hit subscribe to my channel, I'd really appreciate it. And as always, happy hawking.